This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Robert Leyland programmed AtariArtist, KoalaPainter, and MicroIllustrator, along with Steve Dompier, the graphics applications that worked with KoalaPad, Atari Touch Tablet, and Chalk Board PowerPad drawing tablets. Prior to that, he programmed The Dragon's Eye, which was published by Automated Simulations, Murder on the Zinderneuf, published by Electronic Arts, and, with Jaron Lanier, the Atari version of Alien Garden for Automated Simulations. This interview took place on January 21st, 2023.
So you can possibly tell from my accent, I'm actually from New Zealand. I wasn't born in the United States. And I grew up thinking I was going to be an electronic engineer or an astronaut or something like that. I wanted to be on the hardware technical side. And in high school, this is in the early 1970s, the electronics thing was shifting towards computers. And I was really fortunate in my high school to have the New Zealand equivalent of an American AP class in applied math, which had a computer science unit. So in high school, I learned to program in Fortran with punch cards and all that kind of stuff. And I realized that I was actually at that point, I kind of realized I was more interested in computers than I was in electronics. And I started shifting into the computer side of things. But it really wasn't until I was in college and I got like A's in computer science and C's in physics that it was pretty clear that computers were where I was at. Yeah. And along the way, I built my own computer, using 6800 and pieces, and I had a video display on it and a bunch of other stuff that I'd done on the electronic side. Knowing that I was going to work in software, I got it with the maximum amount of memory. I got it with 1K of memory. Normally it only had 128 bytes, and I got it with a full K of memory, which these days is about the size of the keyboard buffer and the buffer in your keyboard. From that, when I was in college, I did some electronic engineering units and physics, but my degree ended up being in math because it was before they really had a computer science department. I mean, they had a computer science classes, and the units counted towards degrees, but they didn't have a major in computer science at that point. So I did what I could and got a degree in math. And while I was in college, we were playing board games at clubs and societies, the Tiddlywinks and Knucklebones Society and the Tonight's the Night Club and a few other things like this, where we got playing board games. And one of my friends at the board game thing had bought a Commodore PET and was concerned that he was having difficulty because he really wanted to make a computer game on it and didn't know it. And this was actually before the Atari had been released. And he was concerned that maybe he should have bought an Apple II instead, but the Apple II was a bit more expensive and a bit harder to get in New Zealand. I looked at it, studied a little bit, wrote some assembly language routines for him to animate, to do some animation, basically page flipping animation. And these days we'd call it blitting or something like that, but basically the ability to blit rectangles of filled rectangles and animated images. And that turned out to actually be beyond him. He couldn't actually do anything, but it kind of got me going. And what I'd done to test it was I'd written a little animation of a guy holding a sword and poking it, poking with this, going sideways, poking with the sword. And that turned into a game after I'd been working with it for a while, called Dragon's Eye, which got eventually published by Automated Simulations. I guess we're now into full-on interview. That got published by Automated Simulations. I kind of got the game up to a certain point. At the time, it was called the Magician's Hat because that was one of the treasures you found in it. And they wanted a slightly better name, so they picked one of the other treasures, which was the Dragon's Eye. and that became the title of the game. It got I shopped it to a couple of different companies in the US, including one that we'd had some contact with before. So I'll back up a little bit. When I was finished with college, I came to the US on a kind of as a tourist because I wanted to see Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area, and I visited Atari in Silicon Valley, Apple, Ohio Scientific out in Ohio, which was quite a trip and one I'm happy not to ever make again. but it was pretty fascinating. I mean, I'm glad to have done it. Apple wasn't that interested, but Atari actually offered me a job, but I was right out of college and I wasn't ready to move at that point. And so I got to see the insides of Atari and learn about things like benefits, which benefits packages, which were completely unknown in New Zealand. We have with socialized medicine, it was really fascinating. And I remember that Atari at the time, the internal people, the engineers that I was talking to, were trying to get the 810 disk drive finished, the floppy disk drive, and they were trying to work on ways of improving the performance of the drive. I can't remember if it had actually been released, but the hardware had been designed. And I was talking to one of the software engineers, and we were trying to figure out, we were bouncing ideas around. And I think that's why they offered me a job, was because I guess some of my ideas must have been useful. But I was too young, too naive to want to move to the US at that time. Anyway, later on, when we contacted with Automated Simulations, actually, they offered me a job once I'd got the Dragon's Eye done. And what they asked was, before you come back, can you finish Dragon's Eye for the Atari? And since I'd already kind of like seen the Atari from the things, I was really quite willing to do that. And they sent me back to New Zealand with an Atari, with a thing while they organized the job stuff.
So how did you meet the Automated Simulations people? One of your stops in the tour?
Yeah, one of my stops in the tour, I'd run across them, and we'd played their games a number of times. Quite a few of their earlier games were ones that were popular with our group because they were often somewhat Dungeons and Dragons oriented. When I went there, I met 3 or 4 people: Norm Lane, Susan Lee Merrow, Diane Asher, John Freeman and Ann Westfall, who were, and of course, and Paul Ritchie and Eric Wilmunder, who were like early industry software and game design people, and it was really fascinating. Anyway, I go back to New Zealand. I do the Atari version, which I really enjoyed doing, and come back to the US with a completed Atari version. Go to Automated Simulations. They've got a job lined up for me. They filled in all the paperwork and stuff like that. But none of the people I'd met were there anymore. They'd had a corporate change of direction, and it was interesting. And I worked there for 4 months, and looked up some of the people who had been there, and most of them were kind of hesitant to tell me what had happened. And it turned out they had a corporate change of direction, and the movement of the people was such that a lot of the people who were there didn't want to keep going. This is
right.
One
is
of
this
those
when
things
they kind of wanted to go from like war games, simulation games, and moving into more action adventure games, right?
Right. Yeah. And actually, they were actually headed towards making cartridge games, which might have been a good idea if the cartridge market wasn't so cost. The cost benefit analysis of making cartridges is pretty tricky, and I think the fact that the video games industry moved more and more to discs and CDs and then DVDs and now online kind of indicates that the market was moving away from fixed hardware and more towards softer software. The like less physical, more ephemeral. So I felt like they made a poor strategic choice. but while I was there, I worked on 2 or 3 games, a couple of which were really fascinating. Alien Garden was with Jaron Lanier, was a fascinating game, like the concept of it, but it was so kind of left field out there that I don't think it was a commercial success.
I don't think I've ever played it. Tell me about it. I should know about it, but I don't.
Basically, you're flying a little wee saucer ship thing in a field of crystals, and every time you interact with one of the crystals, it grows or shrinks, and depending on how you interact with it, which you have to explore as you're playing the game, like you might if you shoot at it, it might destroy it, or it might make it grow because you're feeding energy into it, and you're trying to recognize the shapes of the crystals and their activity based on how you interact with them, and trying to make the garden, to fill the garden, to complete the garden. As I said, left field concept, but really fascinating. And
they were trying. I mean, some of those game companies were really trying some left field stuff. I mean, I don't think anybody really knew what was going to stick. I mean, Electronic Arts came out with like Worms, which was like this weird program, you know, and Alien Garden and things like. Well, we don't know what people are going to like. Let's try something new, right?
And really, it was awesome because you were. I'm thinking about Ricochet, which was a game that Norm Lane did that was all in 4th. And I would actually tell you the truth, I think Alien Garden was mostly in 4th. What my role on it was the assembly language side of it. And they were absolutely experimenting with it because you really didn't know what was going to do it. I mean, who would have thought that a game about rescuing people with a helicopter would win out, or right. Anyway, there were a number of things. So I stayed at EPYX for about somewhere between 4 and 6 months, I think, before I moved on.
So what was it before we move on? What was it? Tell me more about the, I don't know, the environment there. Was it fun? Were you working hard?
Oh yeah, no, everything we did was working hard. It was pretty fun. I mean, there was some definitely good people there. People that to this day I still admire and look to, like Bob Campbell, who went on to do music stuff. Chet, whose last name I forget right now, but if someone said it, I would go, oh yeah, that's the guy. Who was our manager, was really good. And we had really good camaraderie. We worked on. I remember helping the guy make the Platomania, the one where you're trying to shuffle and spin platters on poles. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting time because it was during the transition from what I would call single person development teams to multiple person development teams. Like prior to the early 1980s, 82 or so, pretty much one person worked on a game. I would say 90% of the games were a single person. And automated simulations in the early days was actually pretty interesting because they typically paired up a game designer with a programmer. And the engineer, the programmer, did all the computer-related stuff, but the game designer would do art and would do game design things like balancing and gameplay and things. And that was sort of very forward thinking. Like almost every other company was doing. It was one person, one job. You did everything. Dragon's Eye, I did everything on it, and as a result, it didn't have any sound. Actually, I've got a copy here. I can show you a picture. That's Dragon's Eye right there. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can. That's some quality 80s box art right there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's George Barr. And the thing about automated simulations and EPYX was their production values were really pretty high. They used box. They hired real artists. They hired real writers to write the manuals, and that was very attractive. I mean, it was much better than the plastic bag with stapled cardboard over the top.
Sure.
that a lot of the companies did. Yeah.
Were you getting royalties for these games?
Yes. So I never actually got any royalties for Dragon's Eye. Uh, I had been working for a company in New Zealand that I started with some friends, and uh, that company effectively owned Dragon's Eye. And so when I moved to the US and the game was finished, the royalty checks went to New Zealand, and I didn't see any of it.
I see.
So
Was
yeah,
that Southern Software?
yeah, Southern Software, yeah, yeah,
I see.
yeah, and which it no longer exists and probably didn't exist for very long afterwards. But there was a bunch of us started a company to do small computer software, mostly business oriented. So we did accounts receivable, accounts payable, inventory control, billing, things like that. Stuff that these days I can remember dimly in the past, and everybody uses QuickBooks for now. So, but
Sure.
yeah, I got distracted. What was I talking about?
So you're talking about you're at EPYX, and then I think you were going to go into what changed and what was next.
Oh yeah, so the concept of multiple person teams was something that they kind of pioneered it at Automated Simulations. And when I was there, EPYX was shifting to making these cartridge games, and they were dropping back to one person teams. And I felt like this was definitely going in the wrong direction. Anyway, uh, my soon-to-be wife convinced me that it would probably be a good idea to move on from EPYX, and that was Diane, and she'd been the director of marketing at EPYX and had like overseen their change of name from Automated to EPYX, and then they'd had this corporate shift to go towards cartridges, and that's when she left. But so through her, I hooked back up with John Freeman, Ann Westfall, and Paul Ritchie, and that was Freefall Associates, and they had connected with a new up and coming software company that had video game company that had this idea that maybe we should be promoting the designers of the games, the makers of the games, rather than just the game itself. We'd try and brand it, and that was Electronic Arts. And so we agreed to do two contracts with EA. One was Archon and the other was Murder on the Zinderneuf. And I chose to do Murder on the Zinderneuf because one of my friends in New Zealand had been working on a computer chess game, and I didn't want to step on toes, even though I knew there was no connection. It was just one of those things where it's like, but we helped each other, like we helped each other set up tools. We shared a little bit of code to help each other going. So there's some stuff in Archon that I helped with, and there's some stuff in Zinderneuf that Anne helped with. And so we had two programmers, Anne Westfall and myself, and two designers, John Freeman and Paul Ritchie. And that's when I did Zinderneuf. And Zinderneuf for EA was a 3-month project, and it went really well. The entire thing's in assembly language. And it was 100% Atari, all on the machine. I made as much use of the system as I possibly could, sound, display lists, all the chips that I knew about at the time. And the only sticking point was we did the inside of for those who are listening and don't know about it, Murder on the Zinderneuf is a murder mystery where you're in the tradition of the Agatha Christie mysteries, you're on a moving vehicle which you can't get off, so it's effectively a locked room or locked mansion mystery, and you're walking around or wandering around in the Zeppelin, interviewing potential suspects who are characters in the story, about the person who died, and one of the characters is missing because they're dead, and the other they've been pushed off the back of the Zeppelin or something, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And the story used a conversational interface, which at the time was new. You didn't actually need to type anything in. You picked from a selection of questioning modes, so you could be aggressive or conciliatory or something like that. And depending on your choice of detective and which character you were doing, you would get a different response. And all those responses were generated from templates. I'm probably going off the deep end here, but it was a fun game. But it made you think. You had to think about what was going on and try and read between the lines about what was happening. And but I computer graphics wise, I'd use the GTIA mode, the 16 color mode, to create the backgrounds, which meant they were absolutely beautiful. These lovely floors with, you know, tiles and stuff for the time. You know, let's be fair, this is, you know, 1980, 81 kind of era. Actually, I think it was released in 83. I think it was released in 83 and 82. Yeah, because I'm looking at a copy of the Zinderneuf here, and it says, yeah, for machines sold after January 82. So, or had a GTIA. And
yeah, Atari Mania says 83, so that
yeah,
seems reasonable. Yeah.
Seems reasonable. Yeah, it's a while back now. Actually, that's 40 years ago. Yeah, shocking.
Holy moly.
Yeah, holy moly, yeah. And they were concerned that there were a lot of machines out there that didn't have GTIA, but the group were kind of unwilling to change it because it would have required an awful lot of rework to make it, you know, work in a non-GTA thing. As it happens, I don't think it really mattered that much. You could still play it on the old CTIA, the system. It just looked a bit funky. It didn't look anywhere near as good as it did on GTIA. I'd like to think we helped Atari sell GTIA upgrades.
You made the right choice making it a GTA game. Yeah. And that game, I mean, it was one of the benefits of that game was it was replayable because there would be a different murderer every time. Unlike playing, I don't know, Zork or something, where once you knew how it was solved, you knew how it was solved. This is more like Clue, where there'd be a different murderer every time. So was it a challenge just figuring out all the possibilities and the maps of, I don't know, how things could work out?
Yes. So I'll backing up a second. That was one of the benefits of having a designer involved. So I was able to put together a system for them where the designers could we created templates for the story, and we would have roles. So there would be the murderer, the victim, the witness, and so on, and those would get chosen based on the scenarios. We'd have a scenario, there'd be an initial setup where you know, you would pick the scenario you were playing, which I can't even remember how it was chosen, but you would pick the scenario, and then somebody would be picked as a victim, and there was a list of for each scenario there was a set of the characters that could be the victim. There was another set that could be the witness, another set that could be the such and such. And so you would be picking from the code, the game code would pick from that list which ones it would be, and then it would adjust the tenses, gender, and plurals of all of the phrases in the scenario to match that. So you could have one of the scenarios, which also got us into trouble, was a love triangle, and one of the people in the love triangle had been killed and was, you know, thrown out the back, and you were trying to figure out who the lovers were, and those could be the traditional love triangle is, you know, boy boy girl, or boy girl girl, and somebody would die. And but we had one scenario there which was boy boy boy, so it's a gay love triangle. And I remember the marketing department came back to us, EA's marketing department said, we're not sure we can have homosexuality in our things. And John Friedman's answer was, we're talking about a murder here, and you're worried about whether these people loved each other or not. It was a fun time. but yeah,
did it make it in?
Oh yeah, totally. Yep.
Love it.
We stuck on that. Yeah, it was really good. And all the scenarios happened that, and we had another one which was probably the most focused of the scenarios was the one where the lead character could only be a young woman because she was the lost Romanov, the lost princess of Russia. And so there were only two, I think, choices in that one of who the victim could be, but the choices of who killed her were very wide. That was probably the most constrained of the stories, that one. But most of the stories had, 3, 4 different people could be victims. So I think the total number of scenarios was 8 times 3. So there were roughly 24 different victims, and each of those could have, another dozen or so things. So I think there were well over 100 different scenarios. But one of the things that made that game possible was the fact that the Atari. I know I could have done it on an Apple or even a Commodore, but one of the things that was made it nice about that was I could do the whole thing in assembly language. And the Atari, one of the really nice features about the Atari was that it actually had an operating system. It actually had the file control blocks and other aspects of the system that were built into the internal ROMs of the machine, so that you didn't have to deal with disk management. Like, I didn't have to include code to read the disk because it was already built into the operating system. I could talk to it, and that meant that I could write the code. I could create tools in BASIC that would create files on the disk that would then be read by the assembly language programs, and that included fonts, the scenarios, the opening animation, a whole bunch of stuff that was on the disk instead of in the game in game memory. So I could fit the entire game in 32K, and the scenarios would get loaded off the disk, processed, and started up. And it only took it a couple of seconds to read a few sectors off the disk to start the game up, and that actually worked really well. I was really happy with how well that worked out. So yeah, there was a lot to love about the Atari 800 and family, actually 400, 800, and I think this one says 1200 XL. I'm pretty sure it would have worked on the 600 as well. Yeah.
There's no reason it shouldn't have.
Yeah.
It worked on the 400.
Yeah.
Do you remember what flavor of assembler you used?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure I used AMAC. Yes, yeah, I used AMAC, but the one with the built-in editor, so it had an editor assembler. I used later on. I used DDT, the Dunyan's debugging tool, and a few other things like that. At the time, I did Zinderneuf. We also had RAM disks at that time, which were like super cool. I mean, having 128K that was as big as the floppy disk, and you could do everything on it, made the whole development iterative cycle so much faster than trying to do it on disk drives that you wore out. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So you elected to work on Zinderneuf instead of Archon, and Zinderneuf, I believe, was well reviewed, but Archon was a runaway success.
Oh yeah.
Did you feel like you made the wrong choice?
Oh, of course. but it wasn't I don't feel like it was really the wrong choice. It was a choice, and it probably could have been the other way, but it goes along with the same thing as you don't really know what's going to be successful and what's not. And I was really happy for John and Anne and Paul, for that matter, to do it, to have that success. It was great. And it was really fun, and I'm still really good friends with all of them. It's not like it was a social issue. It was fine. It was great. I continued to work with Paul actually for years afterwards, including Toys for Bob, Star Control, and then the last project I worked with them on was Skylanders.
After Zinderneuf, what was next for you?
So Zinderneuf wrapped up, and Diane, my wife, had.
Let's get to that. Let's talk about the love, how programmers find love.
Oh yeah.
How did you met Diane? You mentioned her before. Tell me that story.
Yeah. So I met Diane at Automated Simulations when I first came over with the game, and we signed a contract and stuff like that. And she was the director of marketing. And she showed me what they would do, and I worked with I met Bernie DeKoven, and Bernie ended up writing the manuals for thing. Bernie was a really fascinating game designer. Like he had been anyway, I'm digressing. Yeah, Bernie was great. And I met Diane, and she was pretty helpful. She explained what would happen in the marketing, stuff like that. And she invited us to a party, which I went to with John and Ann. They drove me out there because it was out on Bethel Island, way out in the boonies, out halfway to Sacramento, which was probably further than I'd driven ever before, or been driven before, because New Zealand's not as big. And at the party was Diane's partner Steve Dompier. But there were other people there that were really fascinating too. Peter Jennings, the guy that founded VisiCalc, and Scott Anderson, who made a program called DataDex, which was kind of influential in the early database, personal database management stuff. Anyway, and it was pretty fascinating. It was really fun to meet all these people. And then I, go back to New Zealand, do the Atari version, come back, and Diane's not at Automated anymore, and I get pointed to say, well, you should probably talk to her to find out what's happened. It wasn't just Diane; it was all the other people that I'd known who had been working there were no longer there. And so I went out to see Diane, and we had spent a nice afternoon out out at Bethel Island, looking at boats going by and talking about what was going on and why things had changed. And we kind of hit it off, but it was just a nice conversation, chat kind of thing. And I went back to Palo Alto, where I was staying, and started thinking about what I wanted to do. She said I should probably, it'd probably be better to leave EPYX, because the direction they're going isn't where you want to be, or where we think the games industry is really going. And she called the house, and I thought she was calling for Bernie, but she was calling for me, and we ended up going out on a date and things, and hit it off. And we rented a house in Livermore, and for a while I was commuting down to Sunnyvale, to Mountain View, and she was commuting out to Bethel Island from Livermore, because it's about halfway between. And because she was doing the marketing for Steve Dompier, who was building a computer graphics program called the Illustrator. And the Illustrator was a pretty extensive paint program for the Apple II that used Apple's graphics tablet. And Steve and Diane got in contact with, were contacted, I should say, because they were showing it off at various computer fairs, by a company that was making a little miniature graphics tablet. People recognized that graphics tablets were kind of a fun interface device for drawing, and this was the KoalaPad. And while I was working on Zinderneuf, they were starting to do some work on a Koala, what they call it, the MicroIllustrator, which was a cut down version of the Illustrator, really designed for, if you like, kids to use. And Steve was really good programmer, knew the Apple II inside and out, but didn't really know a lot about the other machines. I mean, I'm sure he would have picked it up if he'd been bothered to, but they were kind of in a hurry. And Diane said, and Koala said, well, we really want it on the Atari. And then later on, they said they really wanted it on the Commodore 64, but that's later. So Diane said, well, Robert knows the Atari, can he do it? And so I ended up working with them, and made the KoalaPad MicroIllustrator, which led to other companies coming and saying, oh, this is must-have software if you're making a graphics interface device. And we made I think 20 something different versions of the MicroIllustrator for a variety of different
Wow.
computers and input devices. The first of them was the KoalaPad, and I ported the MicroIllustrator to the Atari so that it worked in the highest res graphics mode on the Atari, and um, used Atari's I/O, the the KoalaPad on the Atari, and the KoalaPad was cool. It was a little square thing that you just used pressure on, and it was the first one, and they did a really neat job. It was a nifty little machine. From a technical perspective, it was a little bit noisy. So as you moved your finger around, and your finger's a big thing to draw with. So they gave us little styluses. I think I might still have some styluses. I don't think I have a KoalaPad anymore, but I think some of the styluses are still around, which helped. But it was sort of noisy, and if you just directly translated the input to the screen, you get a ziggy-zaggy line going across the screen. So that got us doing filtering and other things. And when we started doing filtering, I realized that we didn't have any curves. We had no way of doing curves. So we built Bezier splines into it and a couple of other things to make the paint system. But it was interesting because we did the KoalaPad, and then another company came along and wanted us to do it for their EduPad or something. It was a giant pad.
Oh, the big one. Yeah,
yeah,
the Chalk Board PowerPad.
Thank you, Chalk Board PowerPad. Thank you. I was trying to remember the name of it. Yeah, and that one was actually pretty cool because it was such a big tablet. But of course, we were still dealing with a fairly low resolution display. For the time, it was high res, but actually, it was a pretty low res display. These days, on your web browser, you're talking about a postage stamp
Right.
size picture, yeah. And that was a pretty cool one, but it was even noisier. It was very hard to get a good signal out of it. And then Atari came along and brought their one out, which was rectangular.
Right. The Atari Touch Tablet.
Atari Touch Tablet, yeah.
Right.
And of those three tablets, the Atari one was probably the nicest. It was of course very specific to the Atari, but the tablet's aspect ratio matched the TV, and it was probably the least noisy of the tablets. So you got the best performance with it. Also, when you're drawing on it and trying to draw a circle, if you draw a circle like this, it'll show up as a circle on the screen. Whereas on the KoalaPad, if you draw a circle like this, it actually has to expand it horizontally, so you get a bit you get some distortion on your output display. But it was pretty fun. The 20 different versions happened over the course of 3 or 4 years, so it wasn't like I was doing those. But I mean, it is interesting that the projects were completed that we made were often completed in pretty short time frames. Murder on the Zinderneuf was a 3-month project from pretty much from beginning to end. It was, I think there was maybe a week or so of testing, week or two of testing, and the hardest thing for me to do was actually to get EA's copy protection system working with the game. And I honestly don't remember now why it was such an issue, but I do remember that it was a bit of a problem to get the copy protection built in because I was using the operating system and the disk access routine, and actually accessing the disk. They had some issues with their copy protection. But another story. I was going to touch on something when we talked earlier about working hard. When we were doing MicroIllustrator, we were doing it at my house in Livermore, and Steve was staying with us for like a week at a time while we would do it, and he would go home typically once a week. He'd go home and spend a night at his place, but otherwise he was spending nights at our place in Livermore, and we'd wake up in the early afternoon, work until about maybe have a light supper or something, work late, and typically until about 5 a.m., just straight working straight through, programming on one or two different computers at the same time. These days we might call that pair programming, but it was a pretty new concept at the time. Then at about 5 a.m. when the sun was rising, we'd go out for a mountain bike ride. We'd ride on the trails through Livermore on mountain bikes and have a breakfast at Lions, the old Lions diner style location, and then come home and sleep. And sleep until early afternoon and then do it again. And in some ways, we were both pretty young. I was in my early 20s and Steve was in his actually mid 20s and Steve was maybe 30. And we were both in actually incredibly good shape because we would go for an hour, literally an hour-long mountain bike ride every day. But we were also programming and basically sitting around on our butts for the rest of the time. But and essentially that was that project was really the basis of Island Graphics, of the Island Graphics company, which grew at some point to over 100 people and was doing projects on Sun Microsystems workstations and video engineering products and all kinds of stuff. And in the process of doing the first couple of versions, we got contracts to do many more. I think I personally was probably responsible for 9 or 10 of them. Steve did another 3 or 4 before moving.
These were for different systems, not just for the Atari, I'm assuming.
Most of the ones I did were for the Atari. I also did some of the early Commodore ones, but we actually hired a guy to do Commodore. I did the Tandy Radio Shack color computer version, and I forget all the other systems that we did. We ended up doing one for the MSX system, which involved taking a trip to Japan to figure out what they needed. That was a Z80 based home computer that the Japanese were making. Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of different versions.
Yeah.
We did some for the different machines that Commodore made. Commodore at some point, that before the C64, which was their probably most popular one, they also had the smaller one, the C16 or the C4.
Well, they had the VIC-20 but there was also a Commodore 16, which was a complete failure, and a bunch of other weird ones. Yeah.
Right. The VIC-20 was the one I was thinking about. Yeah. So they made the VIC-20, then they made the Commodore 64, and then they had a couple of more machines after that. One was called the TED. I don't know if you remember that one. But on most of Commodore's machines, I wasn't really very happy with. We'd had Commodore PETs in New Zealand, and those were actually pretty good machines. If you got the versions with the nice keyboard, if you got the version with the clicky keyboard, they weren't that good. But the version with the good keyboard was actually a pretty solid computer. But Commodore's low-cost production meant that you got a low. It's been 40 years. I can probably say this now. You got a low quality product because of it. And Commodore, even I think if I remember right, and this could be spurious, even had issues with returns that they would then resell, and they got into trouble for doing it because one person's failed machine that mostly worked might be good enough for somebody else, and they were like playing fast and loose with their inventory, and they got into trouble with like the SEC and the anyway. I have my issues with Commodore. Apparently, a lot of people do.
Well, this is an Atari podcast. You're not going to.
I'm not going to offend.
We're not Commodore fans here.
Actually, I mean, the thing that's to me that's really interesting is the flip-flop of Commodore and Atari. The Tramiels, who owned Commodore, bought the Amiga system, and Amiga was an Atari. I mean, lineage was
Atari. Absolutely.
Yeah. Dale Luck, Jay Miner, all of those people had been Atari engineers, and that was a product that Island Graphics worked with, and we were there when Commodore bought them. It's like Amiga had been talking to us about putting the Illustrator, not just the MicroIllustrator, but the full Illustrator paint program on the Amiga because it really could handle it and deserved it. And then Commodore came in and bought them, and we already had a relationship with Commodore, so they were quite happy to extend it and to do stuff. But it was so weird to be working on it was like was working on an Atari again, but now it was owned by Commodore, which was a very strange thing. And then the engineers that had done the Commodore people ended up buying Atari and made the Atari. I forget what its name was now. Their 16-bit computer. Do you remember the name
the
of
ST machines?
ST, thank you. Yeah, the ST, which was basically a Commodore. It was like a Commodore 64. So it was like the two companies had done a flip-flop, and anyway, very strange.
Yeah.
Strange time. Yeah.
So did you say the first version of MicroIllustrator you did was for Koala? Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You must have felt very wise in like not selling them everything and keeping the rights to reuse that code for other projects and then reselling it 20 times.
That was definitely not me. That was so Steve was smart, and he got in touch with, well, actually, Steve and Diane were smart. I think a large part of this is Diane, actually. She had worked for a guy named Bill Baker, who had run Information Unlimited software. And Bill was a pretty sharp cookie, and he and his lawyer, Dan Reamer, we brought them into Island Graphics to sort this out. And they got the contractual stuff sorted out so that we didn't sell full rights to them. And Steve hadn't been burned before, but he had worked. So Steve's origin, Steve when he was a kid, when he was younger, he bought one of the very first Altair computers, the MITS Altair 8080, giant blue box with little buttons on the front. Sure. Yeah. And programmed it and showed it off at the West Coast, not the Computer Fair, but the West Coast Computer Club, which was, Silicon Valley Computer Club, where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak hung out. And he'd shown it playing music on a radio, and by changing the loop frequency of a thing, you could play,
causing interference that would play on an AM radio.
Play an AM radio, yeah. And he'd done that at the show, and he basically
homebrew computer club, probably
homebrew computer club, right. And he'd hand punched in the code to do this, because you had no mass storage. I mean, even then, having a paper tape reader was a complete luxury. Like, very few people actually had one of those. Anyway, and he'd been one of the people involved in a company called Processor Technology, which made the Sol computer, which was an early competitor of the Apple and pre-IBM. So it had been an early competitor, and that was probably the first computer that was an integrated computer and keyboard. And then Apple came out very shortly afterwards. The Apple I was a computer in a box, and the keyboard wasn't really attached. When they did the Apple II, they made that really nice case design with the lever things. And the Processor Tech had a case that was metal and could put a S100 card in it horizontally. They would slide in the back of the machine with the card flat, which was kind of innovative, because most of the S100 systems were, giant boxes with vertical cards in them. But they could fit, I think, 2 or 3 S100 cards in their computer. It was a very, very clever design. But Processor Technology folded because the founders couldn't get along with each other, and it just collapsed. It could well have been an Apple. If they'd been able to stick it out, they could well have been an Apple. I was going somewhere with this. So Steve retreated to his island and started working on computer graphics and wrote the big paint program. And his big paint program was awesome. It could do all kinds of stuff and was really clever. There was a lot of things in about it that were really neat. But he was never going to finish it, because he's going to keep adding to it and keep going on it. So the MicroIllustrator was a carve out that let us complete a product out of a huge project. Like, we were able to carve out this the segment of it that was necessary to a minimum, kind of a minimal segment, a minimal slice that was necessary to make a product that was worthwhile. And I've got Steve was good. He figured out how to what we needed. Dan Riemer was good at figuring out the contracts. Bill Baker and Diane were good at finding organizations that would. I mean, Bill was also there for funding. He helped fund the company, and Diane was really good at finding the companies and interfacing with the companies that had graphics tablets and light pens and I can't even remember. There were so many different things and new companies. And I think we did like 8 or 10 versions just for Koala for all the different machines that were around. And that got Island Graphics up and rolling. It was pretty fun times. And I rolled off doing Zinderneuf, which was the last game I did for a number of years. Worked on computer graphics, and in like late 1980s, I switched back to doing computer games because I'd been doing computer graphics at Island for a number of years on video graphics and stuff. Yeah.
Nice.
I've rambled.
Awesome. And I guess that was about it for the stuff you did for 8-bit machines, Ataris and things, right? I mean, you worked on...
Yes. After that, the world had moved to the home computing and game playing had moved on to consoles. So when I sort of came back into the games industry, we were doing stuff for the IBM PC, and most of the games industry at that point was IBM PC and then consoles. And so the next machine that I spent a lot of time on was the Sega Genesis, which is not, I wouldn't call it a successor to the Atari, but it had some similarities. I mean, that was a nice little machine as well. And I did a lot of, it's a bigger system, so there was some assembly language, but most of your program at that point, you're programming in C rather than in assembler. Programming the 8-bit machines, we used BASIC, Forth, and assembly language as our primary programming languages. But the big thing with the 8-bit machines was what other tools you had to help you. So, and I think I mentioned already, Dunyan's debugging tool, DDT, I used that so much when we were doing MicroIllustrator. It was very important at that point. I used the AMAC, the Atari Macro Assembler, and I think they had a cartridge version of it. I can't remember actually.
They had an assembler on cartridge that you probably didn't use because it was very slow.
Very slow, yes, that's right. And I remember starting using that one and realizing how abysmal it was. And then we got AMAC, the disk-based one. That and the RAM disk sped up the productivity about at least an order of magnitude, as I recall. Yeah. We did Norm Lane, who I worked with at EPYX, was really big on Forth. And so we did, EPYX did a lot of stuff in Forth. He did Ricochet, we did Alien Garden. Platomania, I think, was assembly language. And there were a number of other products at that time that were in Forth as well. I think even Worms, the EA one, might have been in Forth.
Right, that was in Forth, yeah.
Yeah. Which reminds me, I dug up some discs, so I have a...
Oh, do you have source code? Do you have source code, sir?
I have source code for some stuff. Like I've got a complete listing of the AtariArtist source code. And,
nice. We got a ream of printout paper still on the tractor feed. Love it.
Yeah, exactly. Tractor feed, printed paper with the MicroIllustrator.
Okay.
And this was printed. This was printed by Atari. The Atari software department actually printed this for us, and pretty handy. I mean, I'd been used to that when I was in college, so it was nice to have a printout. It's hard to get a handle on the scope of a project until you can get like a listing of it, at least at that time when it's in assembly language.
Sure.
It's complex. I have some source code here, not for most games, but only products that I worked on. Here's a Rescue on Fractalus.
Sure.
I don't know what that one was. Oh, Bill Budge, Pinball Construction Set.
Sure.
Can't even see that.
Yep.
Mule. Here's an Archon, and you can see the fantasy at your fingertips.
And to listeners, he's not showing me source code discs. These are just the commercial discs. Don't get up. Don't get excited with Mule source code. We do not.
And I think I'm not sure about this one. This is a prototype.
Archon 2 Adept. Yeah, that was the follow-on.
The follow-on
looks like a beta of Adept.
Yeah, that was a playtest version. This one that says CCC on it, that's Crush, Crumble, and Chomp. So I've been friends with Eric Wilmunder for years as well. He lives 2 miles from me now. He worked on Rescue on Fractalus, on
Temple of Apsi, Star Raiders 2. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and so I've known him for a while. I'm trying to look at some of these. Most of these are things, but actually, really look at this because I have some discs, some source discs. I'm pretty sure I have the source code for MicroIllustrator, for at least 1 or 2 versions of MicroIllustrator, and for I definitely have the source code for Murder on the Zinderneuf and some of the other projects that I worked on back then. Awesome. Just on discs, loose discs somewhere.
Can I borrow those and we can archive those?
Probably, and I think I'll check. I mean, it's so long ago. I'm pretty sure we're even out of copyrights now, right? Is it 17 years or something? It's the copyright.
The rules have changed, but I don't think there's a lot of commercial value in Atari source code. It's just of interest to people who want to know how things were programmed, and it's more for educational. It definitely would fall under fair use. I'll put it that way.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I have the ability to read all those discs, and we can put that up on GitHub or Internet Archive, and then even the printout that you showed me, we'll photocopy that and we'll get those.
But one thing I wanted to mention about that one of the reasons I really liked the Atari was it was probably, of those machines, one of the best documented machines. Apple had pretty good documentation kind of after the fact. They got a lot of people had reverse engineered it, so there were some really good manuals available for the Apple. But Atari came with manuals. They had Atari's engineering group had really done a good job. The machine was really solid. It had that really nice cast aluminum internal structure for shielding. It was heavy and solid and rugged. My 2-year-old kid couldn't break it, even though he tried really hard. And it came with good manuals. I had an I actually have them here. I have an operating system manual, the source code for both the 800 operating system and the 1200 XL, and the OS manual, the hardware manual, and Day Ray Atari, which was really useful. I mean, yes, along with everybody else, when we first got the Atari, we spent hours typing in basic programs that were published in Antec magazine and was it Action magazine? No, Action was the plug-in
analog magazine. Action was the programming language,
programming cartridge. We spent time typing things in, and but really the availability of of manuals like Day Ray Atari really helped a lot. And Chris Crawford's an interesting guy, and he made Day Ray Atari really did a good job of explaining. He was the author of explaining the ins and outs of working with the Atari, with the Antec chip and the display list interrupts and graphics modes and all kinds of stuff. And the book included some really clever ideas, showed you how to do a scrolling play field and things like that, which we used tremendously afterwards. I mean, that was a huge influence. So I have to give him a lot of credit for that. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, that thing was the Bible, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What do you do these days?
Well, I'm retired now. After um, uh, after working on computer graphics, I went back to video games, and I did several projects on the Genesis. I worked with Paul and Fred on Star Control 1. This is Toys for Bob. At that point, it was with Crystal Dynamics, and Accolade. I did a bunch of projects with Toys for Bob, and eventually and a couple of solo projects. And probably the largest one we did was Skylanders. We did the Skylanders project for Activision, just the little toys that go on the consoles. And my role in that was initially, I was software engineering. I did, we were basically building tools for the designers to work with. And I did the hardware, the electronics. So the portal, the RFID tags and the toys and stuff. That was sort of my build on that. And what I'd really done was figure out how to interface an RFID reader to a Nintendo Wii, so that we could do the tests with the little toys. And that was a great project. That was my. I went out on a high. I'm done. Time to retire. We've got a project that everybody, even my mom, knows about.
Nice. So how do you spend your retirement?
Oh, most recently I've been coaching kids in sports. I figured that I spent 30, 40 years of my life plonking kids down on their butts in front of display screens. So I'm repaying the world by getting a few of them up and moving and kicking soccer balls around. And I've been, the last few years, I've been coaching high school. I coached competitive soccer for 20 or 30 years. And now I'm in my retirement, I'm just doing high school, because high school is a very demanding thing, particularly in the United States, the way high school sports are set up. And it's very hard for the high schools to get coaches who aren't like staff members, who are also extremely busy because of the time requirements. It's very hard to coach high school soccer and have a full-time job at the same time. And you see my beard's blue and pink. That's because the girls dyed it. Yeah, the girls dyed it at soccer practice a week or so ago.
Nice.
Just kind of
price you pay for being a coach, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, team building. Yeah. And I probably look good with those red blue 3D glasses. We'll see.
It's so lifelike.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, reach in. Yeah. And that, and electronics hobbies, and I've got a couple of grandkids now, so it's fun. Yeah.
Nice. If you could send a message to the community of people who still use their Atari computers today, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Have fun with them. I mean, and take care of them, because the electronics is getting a bit old, and I hope a few of them survive in museums. It was really, just remember, it was a really fun time, and it's just amazing now to me that we can emulate the hardware so well on modern computers. It almost makes me not want to turn on my old Atari. I've got one sitting down in my basement. And I think I'm better off using an emulator to
right.
emulate it.
Yeah.
Just have fun with them, because it was a different time. Try not to be too judgmental on the quality of the games, because we were trying to find stuff out. No one really knew what was fun, what was going to be a good game or not. So yeah. And I'm glad people are doing it, interested. That's awesome. Yeah.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.